I saw my son's wife dump something in the water. What I uncovered still haunts me. Margaret had lived near the lake for most of her life, long enough to learn its moods and sounds. In the early mornings, before the town woke up, the water lay smooth and quiet, like a held breath. She liked those hours best. They reminded her of a time when life felt slower and more certain. Since her husband passed away, the mornings had become her private space, a time to think, to remember, and to steady herself before the day began. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. She shared the house now with her son and his wife. It was a modest home, clean and well cared for, with a narrow porch that faced the road and a backyard that sloped gently toward the trees leading to the lake. Margaret was grateful not to be alone. Still, living with others had its own weight. You learned their habits, their silences, the small ways they moved through a room. And sometimes, you noticed things that did not sit right. From the start, Margaret had felt that something about her daughter-in-law was hard to read. The woman was polite, always careful with her words, always quick to help when asked. She kept the house neat and never raised her voice. To anyone looking in from the outside, she seemed like a good wife and a respectful daughter-in-law. Yet beneath that calm surface, Margaret sensed a distance, a guardedness that never quite faded. It was not open rudeness or clear unkindness. It was more subtle than that. Conversations rarely went beyond simple topics. When Margaret tried to share stories from the past, the responses were brief, often polite but empty. There was little warmth in the eyes, no easy laughter. At times, Margaret felt as though she was speaking to someone who was always somewhere else, listening but not fully present. Margaret told herself she might be imagining things. After all, grief had changed her. Losing her husband had made her more sensitive, more alert to shifts in mood. She knew she could be unfair at times, judging silence as coldness, or privacy as secrecy. So she pushed the feeling aside and focused on keeping the peace. This was her son's life now, and she did not want to create tension where there might be none. Life followed a steady routine. Her son left early most mornings for work, often before sunrise. His wife usually slept in later, rising after the house had settled into quiet. Margaret would make her tea, sit by the window, and watch the light spread across the lake in the distance. The days were calm, predictable, and safe, or so she believed. Then one morning, something broke that pattern. Margaret woke before dawn, stirred by a faint sound from downstairs. It was not loud, just the soft closing of a door, careful and controlled. At first, she thought nothing of it. Old houses made noise, and sometimes the wind played tricks on the ears. Still, a small sense of alertness crept in, the kind that comes when something is slightly out of place. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house fell quiet again, but the feeling did not pass. Finally, she rose from bed and moved to the window. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, a pale gray stretching over the trees. That was when she saw her daughter-in-law stepping out of the house. The sight surprised her. It was much earlier than usual, far earlier than she had ever seen the woman awake. She was dressed quickly, not in her normal tidy clothes, but in something darker and looser, as if chosen for speed rather than comfort. In her arms, she carried something large and awkward, wrapped tightly in a thick cloth. Margaret leaned closer to the glass, her heart picking up pace. The bundle looked heavy. Her daughter-in-law struggled slightly as she adjusted her grip, glancing over her shoulder toward the house. Even from a distance, Margaret could sense tension in her movements. This was not the calm, controlled person she knew. The woman moved down the path that led away from the house, toward the trees and the lake beyond. She did not look back again. Margaret felt a pull in her chest, a mix of confusion and unease. Why would she be going to the lake at this hour? And what was she carrying? Margaret told herself to step away, to respect privacy. Yet her feet did not move. Something deeper than curiosity held her in place. She slipped on her robe and quietly opened the back door, careful not to make a sound. The air outside was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of water and earth. Keeping her distance, Margaret followed along the edge of the yard, staying behind the trees where she could not be easily seen. Her heart beat hard in her chest, loud enough that she feared it might give her away. Each step felt heavy, as if she were crossing a line she could not uncross. Through the thinning trees, she caught glimpses of her daughter-in-law ahead. The woman moved quickly now, almost rushing, the bundle pressed tight against her body. At one point, she stumbled slightly, then stopped, breathing hard. She looked around again, her face tight with something close to panic. Margaret's stomach tightened. She had never seen that expression before. It was fear, plain and sharp, written across the woman's features. Whatever she was doing, it was not routine. It was not harmless. The lake came into view, its surface dark and still under the early light. Mist hovered low over the water, blurring the far shore. The place felt quiet in a way that was almost heavy, as though the world were holding its breath. Margaret stopped at the edge of the trees. From there, she had a clear view but remained hidden. She watched as her daughter-in-law reached the water's edge. For a moment, the woman stood there, staring down at the lake. Her shoulders rose and fell as she took deep, uneven breaths. Time seemed to slow. Margaret noticed small details she would later replay in her mind again and again. The way the woman's hands shook. The way she shifted her weight from foot to foot. The way her eyes darted around, checking for anyone nearby. Then, without warning, she lifted the bundle and threw it into the lake. There was a dull splash as it hit the water, followed by ripples spreading outward. The bundle sank quickly, disappearing beneath the surface as if it had never been there at all. Margaret gasped before she could stop herself, clapping a hand over her mouth. Her breath came fast and shallow. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. The act felt wrong in a way she could not explain. It was not just littering or carelessness. It carried weight, intention, and fear. Her daughter-in-law stood frozen for a moment, staring at the spot where the water had closed over the bundle. Her face looked pale, almost empty, as though she were bracing herself for something unseen. Then she turned sharply, scanning the area again. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. For a brief second, their eyes almost met. Margaret felt a cold rush spread through her body. She was certain that if she were seen, there would be no simple explanation for what had just happened. But the woman did not notice her. After another quick glance around, she turned and hurried away from the lake, retracing her steps toward the house. Her pace was faster now, her movements stiff and tense. Margaret remained where she was long after the woman disappeared from view. The silence around the lake felt louder than before. Birds began to stir in the trees, and the mist slowly lifted from the water, revealing a smooth, empty surface. What had been thrown into the lake? The question echoed in Margaret's mind, heavy and unanswered. She searched her memory for any reasonable explanation. Could it have been trash? Something broken? Something private that the woman did not want anyone to see? None of the answers felt right. Margaret made her way back to the house slowly, her legs unsteady. Every familiar sound now felt different, sharper. The house that had once felt safe and known suddenly seemed full of quiet corners and closed doors. She reached her room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They were trembling. She tried to calm herself, to breathe, to tell herself that she had no proof of anything. She had only seen a moment, out of context. Jumping to conclusions would help no one. Yet the image would not leave her mind. The bundle sinking into the lake. The fear on her daughter-in-law's face. The way the woman had looked over her shoulder, as if afraid of being seen. When her daughter-in-law returned to the house, she moved quietly, just as she had left. Margaret heard the soft steps, the careful closing of the door. Later, when the woman appeared in the kitchen, she looked almost normal again. Her hair was neat, her expression calm, her voice steady as she greeted Margaret politely. Margaret answered her, forcing her own voice to sound even. She studied the woman's face, searching for signs of guilt or strain. If there were any, they were well hidden. The calm was back, smooth and controlled, as though the morning trip had never happened. That frightened Margaret more than anything else. As the day went on, she found herself watching more closely than before. Every movement, every glance, every pause felt important. She wondered how long she had been missing things, how much had been happening right in front of her without her noticing. By evening, the lake outside looked the same as it always had, quiet and peaceful. No one passing by would ever guess that something had been thrown into its depths that morning. Something that had changed the way Margaret saw her home, her family, and the woman living under her roof. That night, lying awake in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her thoughts circling endlessly. She realized, with a deep sense of unease, that she no longer felt sure of the person she shared her home with. And once that trust was gone, she did not know how it could ever return. Margaret tried to return to her normal life after that morning, but nothing felt the same. The house looked unchanged, the rooms quiet and familiar, yet a heavy feeling followed her everywhere. It sat in her chest when she walked through the hallway, when she poured tea, when she heard her daughter-in-law's footsteps behind her. The image of the lake kept rising in her mind, sharp and unwanted. She told herself she had to be careful. Fear could twist ordinary things into something dark. She had lived long enough to know that. Still, her instincts refused to rest. They whispered that what she saw was real, that it mattered, and that ignoring it could be a mistake she would regret. Her biggest struggle was her son. He was kind, hard-working, and deeply loyal to his wife. Since his father's death, he had taken on more responsibility than he ever said out loud. Margaret worried constantly about adding to that weight. She loved him too much to hurt him with wild fears or half-formed suspicions. At the same time, the idea of staying silent felt wrong. If something truly dangerous was happening under her roof, did she not have a duty to speak up? The question followed her through the day, with no clear answer. She began to notice things she had once brushed aside. Her daughter-in-law's moods shifted quickly now that Margaret was paying attention. Some mornings she was calm and distant, her face blank and unreadable. Other days she snapped over small things, then apologized just as fast, her voice tight and forced. The cleaning became harder to ignore. The house had always been tidy, but now it was spotless in a way that felt almost desperate. Surfaces were wiped again and again. Floors were scrubbed late into the night. The smell of cleaning spray lingered in the air, sharp and unpleasant. Margaret wondered what someone could be trying so hard to erase. There were also the phone calls. They happened at odd hours, often late at night or early in the morning. Her daughter-in-law would step outside or lock herself in the bedroom, speaking in a low voice. When Margaret passed by, the calls would end quickly. Once, Margaret caught a glimpse of her face during one of those moments. The woman looked tense, her jaw tight, her eyes focused in a way that felt cold. Margaret tried not to stare. She reminded herself that adults deserved privacy. Yet every guarded call made her stomach tighten. One afternoon, while they were alone in the kitchen, Margaret decided to test the ground. She spoke casually, keeping her voice light. She asked how things were going, whether everything felt all right. The question was simple, almost harmless. Her daughter-in-law smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. She said everything was fine. Just stress, nothing more. Work, responsibilities, the usual things. Her tone was polite, calm, and firm, leaving no space for further questions. Margaret nodded and let it go. But inside, her unease deepened. That evening, when her son returned home, Margaret watched him closely. He laughed easily, relaxed in a way that made her heart ache. She saw how much he trusted the woman he had married, how blind that trust might be making him. After dinner, she gathered her courage. She spoke gently, choosing her words with care. She mentioned that his wife seemed tired lately, maybe overwhelmed. She asked if everything was truly okay. He frowned slightly, surprised by the concern. Then he smiled and waved it off. He said she was just stressed. Life was busy. Everyone went through phases like that. There was no need to worry. Margaret tried again, just a little. She asked if there was anything she could do to help, any trouble she should know about. Her son's tone stayed calm but firm. He said there was nothing wrong. He trusted his wife completely. Margaret could hear it in his voice, clear and steady. The conversation ended there. She did not push further. Seeing the certainty in his eyes stopped her. She felt a sharp twist of guilt, as if she were betraying him simply by thinking these thoughts. That night, sleep would not come. Margaret lay awake, listening to the quiet house. Every sound felt louder in the dark. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the distant call of night insects outside. Her mind replayed the morning at the lake over and over, each detail growing sharper. The next day, she walked to the lake alone. She told herself it was only for fresh air, for peace. But the moment she reached the water's edge, her heart began to race. The lake looked harmless, almost beautiful in the daylight. Sunlight sparkled on the surface. Birds skimmed low over the water. Nothing about it hinted at secrets or fear. Margaret stood where she remembered her daughter-in-law standing. She stared at the water, trying to imagine the bundle sinking beneath the surface. The lake was deeper than it looked. Dark shapes shifted below, hidden and unreachable. She felt foolish standing there, staring at nothing. Still, she could not bring herself to leave. She returned to the lake again the following day. And the day after that. Each visit felt heavier than the last. She walked slowly along the shore, searching for any sign, any disturbance. She did not know what she expected to find, but the need to look was strong. At night, fear crept in quietly. What if the bundle held something dangerous? What if ignoring it put her son at risk? The thoughts circled endlessly, with no clear path forward. She also feared being wrong. The idea of accusing someone without proof terrified her. She had seen how easily families could be torn apart by suspicion. One mistake, one false claim, and nothing would ever be the same. Days passed, and the tension inside her grew. Her daughter-in-law continued her routines, but Margaret noticed the strain behind them. There were dark circles under her eyes now. Her movements were sharp, restless. When she thought no one was watching, her hands shook. Margaret felt trapped between silence and action. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she heard her daughter-in-law arguing quietly on the phone. The words were unclear, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. Margaret froze, listening from the hallway. The call ended suddenly, followed by a long silence. When the woman stepped out, she looked startled to see Margaret there. For a brief moment, fear flashed across her face before it vanished. She forced a smile and walked past without a word. Margaret's heart pounded. That look stayed with her long after. That evening, Margaret made a decision she had been avoiding. She could no longer pretend that everything was normal. The fear had grown too large to ignore. It followed her into every room, every thought. She returned to the lake once more, standing at the edge as the sun began to set. The water darkened, reflecting the sky. The place felt quiet and watchful. She knew then that she had reached a turning point. Whatever had been thrown into the lake had changed her life already. Not knowing was worse than knowing. The fear of the unknown pressed down on her harder than any truth could. Margaret straightened her shoulders and took a slow breath. She did not know how she would do it, or what she would find. She only knew that she could not stay silent anymore. For the sake of her son, and for her own peace, she had to find out what lay beneath the calm surface of the lake. Margaret woke before dawn with a feeling that left no room for delay. The sky outside her window was still dark, the house silent. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the soft rhythm of her own breathing. Then the memory returned, sharp and heavy, and she knew she would not find peace unless she acted. She moved quietly, careful not to wake anyone. Her hands shook as she dressed in old clothes she did not mind getting wet or dirty. She paused at the door, her heart aching at the thought of what she was about to do. Turning back felt safer, easier. But safety had already left her. In the shed behind the house, she gathered what she could find. A long wooden pole. A small rake used for clearing weeds. A pair of thick gloves. Each item felt heavier than it should have, as if they carried their own warning. As she walked toward the lake, the morning air wrapped around her, cold and damp. The path felt longer than usual. Every step stirred doubt. She asked herself again and again if she was crossing a line that should never be crossed. But the image of her son's trusting face pushed her forward. The lake came into view, quiet and still under the early light. A thin mist hovered above the water, drifting slowly. The world felt hushed, as though it knew something she did not. Margaret stopped near the spot she remembered. Her stomach tightened. She stood there for a long time, staring at the water, gathering courage. The lake looked innocent, almost peaceful. It was hard to believe it could hide anything terrible. She stepped closer to the edge. The ground was soft beneath her feet, damp with morning dew. She slipped on the gloves, her fingers stiff and clumsy. With the pole, she began to push gently at the water's surface, disturbing the calm. Each movement sent ripples spreading outward. Her heart pounded in her ears. She felt foolish, frightened, and determined all at once. At first, she found nothing. Just weeds, mud, and smooth stones. The pole scraped along the bottom, catching and releasing. Time stretched on. Minutes blurred into hours. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. Her arms ached. Her back protested. Still, she kept searching. Guilt crept in quietly. What if she was wrong? What if she was invading privacy in the worst way? She imagined her son's disappointment, the pain in his eyes if he ever learned what she was doing. She almost stopped. Then the pole snagged on something solid. Margaret froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, carefully, she pulled upward. Whatever it was resisted, tangled in the reeds below the surface. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her grip and pulled again. Something dark shifted beneath the water. Her heart raced. She worked patiently, inch by inch, freeing the object from the reeds. When it finally broke the surface, water streamed down its sides. It was the bundle. Margaret's knees nearly gave way. She dragged it onto the shore, letting it rest on the wet ground. Up close, it looked worse than she imagined. The cloth was soaked and heavy, clinging tightly to what lay inside. A sharp, unpleasant smell rose into the air. She backed away for a moment, pressing a hand to her chest. Her vision blurred. She told herself to breathe. This was the moment she could still turn back. But she knew she wouldn't. With shaking hands, she knelt beside the bundle. The cloth was tied with a rough knot. Her fingers fumbled with it, slipping on the wet fabric. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. When the knot finally loosened, she pulled the cloth back slowly. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then it became clear. Inside were personal belongings. Items that did not belong in a lake. Things that spoke of a life, of intimacy, of secrets never meant to surface. Objects that clearly belonged to someone in her home. Margaret's breath left her in a sharp gasp. There were photos, warped and water-stained, their images still visible. A small notebook, its pages swollen and blurred, but not unreadable. Clothing, folded carefully before being wrapped, as if someone had taken time, even care, before throwing it away. Her hands shook harder now. She recognized the items instantly. There was no room for doubt. This was not trash. This was not harmless. Her mind raced as pieces began to connect in ways she did not want to accept. The late-night calls. The frantic cleaning. The fear she had seen by the water. All of it pointed to something deeply wrong. She picked up the notebook, her fingers barely able to hold it. Some words were smeared, but others were clear enough to read. They spoke of hidden struggles, of desperation, of choices made in panic. The writing felt personal, raw, and unmistakable. Margaret felt cold all over. This was evidence of a secret life, one kept carefully out of sight. A truth that could shatter everything if brought into the light. Her thoughts spiraled. What did this mean for her son? How long had this been going on? And why had these things been thrown away so urgently, so fearfully? The weight of it pressed down on her, heavy and crushing. She realized then that what she feared was not just suspicion or misunderstanding. It was real. And it was far worse than she had imagined. A sound tore from her throat before she could stop it. Margaret screamed. The sound echoed across the water, raw and full of horror. She clamped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her body shook uncontrollably. She staggered back from the bundle, nearly slipping on the wet ground. Her heart felt like it was breaking apart inside her chest. Nothing would ever be the same again. The calm surface of the lake no longer fooled her. It was a mirror now, reflecting the truth she could not unsee. The woman living under her roof was not who she pretended to be. And the danger she sensed was no longer a feeling. It was a fact. Margaret stood there for a long time, staring at the bundle, the lake, the quiet trees around her. The world continued on as if nothing had happened. Birds sang. The breeze stirred the reeds. Inside her, everything had changed. She knew she could not hide this discovery. She also knew that revealing it would tear her family apart. The choice ahead of her felt impossible. As she finally turned away from the lake, her legs weak and her heart heavy, one thought repeated in her mind with terrifying clarity. The truth she had uncovered was only the beginning. Margaret barely slept after leaving the lake. Every time she closed her eyes, the images returned, sharp and heavy. The bundle. The belongings. The truth staring back at her without mercy. Morning came slowly, bringing no comfort with it. She moved through the house like a stranger. The walls felt closer now, the silence louder. Every familiar object seemed to carry a question. How long had this been happening? How much had she missed? Her thoughts pulled her in different directions. One moment she considered calling for help, telling someone, handing the burden over to authorities who would know what to do. The next moment she pictured her son's face if his world collapsed in a single afternoon. The idea felt unbearable. She wondered if protecting him meant staying quiet. Then another thought followed, darker and more honest. Staying quiet would mean carrying the secret herself. It would mean becoming part of the lie. Margaret knew she could not live like that. She waited until the house was empty except for the two of them. Her son left for work as usual, unaware that the ground beneath his life was already cracking. When the door closed behind him, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. The waiting was over. She found her daughter-in-law in the living room, folding laundry with quick, stiff movements. The woman looked up, startled by Margaret's presence. Their eyes met, and something unreadable passed between them. "We need to talk," Margaret said quietly. The words hung in the air. Her daughter-in-law hesitated, then nodded. She set the laundry aside, her hands trembling just slightly. They sat across from each other, the space between them feeling wider than ever. Margaret's heart pounded. For a moment, she struggled to speak. Then she took a breath and forced herself forward. "I went to the lake," she said. The color drained from the woman's face. "I saw you that morning," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "And I found what you threw into the water." Silence filled the room. Heavy. Pressing. Her daughter-in-law's eyes darted toward the door, then back again. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her shoulders began to shake. Margaret leaned forward. "I need the truth," she said. "All of it." The woman broke. Her head dropped into her hands, and a sob escaped before she could stop it. When she finally looked up, tears streaked her face. The calm mask was gone, replaced by raw fear and exhaustion. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. The words spilled out slowly at first, then faster, as if once the door opened, it could not be closed again. She spoke of a life before this one, a past she had worked hard to bury. Mistakes made years ago, choices driven by fear and loneliness. Things she had hidden carefully, even from the man she married. She confessed that the items belonged to someone connected to that past. Someone she never truly escaped. The photos, the notebook, the clothes were reminders she could no longer bear to see. Evidence of a truth that threatened to destroy the life she had built. "I thought if I got rid of them, it would be over," she said through tears. "I thought I could finally breathe." Margaret listened, her chest tight. The confession cut deeper with every word. This was not a small secret. It was a betrayal layered with lies. Her son had built his life on trust that did not fully exist. The woman admitted she had lied from the beginning. About who she was. About where she came from. About parts of her past that still followed her like a shadow. She spoke of guilt that never faded and fear that ruled her choices. "I love him," she said desperately. "I never meant to hurt him. I just wanted a fresh start." Margaret felt tears sting her own eyes. Love, she realized, was not always enough to protect people from harm. The room felt too small for the weight of the truth. Margaret thought of her son's laughter, his kindness, his faith in the woman sitting across from her now. She felt anger rise, sharp and painful, followed by sorrow. "You took away his choice," Margaret said quietly. "You built his life on something false." The woman nodded, her face crumpling. "I know. And I hate myself for it." Margaret sat back, her mind racing. The path ahead was clear, even if it was painful. Doing nothing was no longer an option. The secret was too big, too dangerous to stay buried. She understood then that silence would not protect her son. It would only delay the damage and deepen it. By staying quiet, she would be helping the lie survive. Margaret stood slowly, her legs weak but her resolve firm. "This can't stay hidden," she said. "Not anymore." The woman looked up, fear filling her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "You'll destroy everything." Margaret shook her head. "The truth already has. I just uncovered it." She turned away, her heart breaking with every step. She knew the choice she was about to make would change their lives forever. There would be pain, anger, and loss. But there would also be honesty. As Margaret left the room, one thing was clear. She would not be complicit in a lie that could ruin the people she loved. Whatever came next, the truth was finally coming into the light. Margaret waited until evening to speak to her son. The hours before he came home felt endless. She moved through the house slowly, touching familiar things as if trying to memorize them. She knew that after tonight, nothing would feel the same again. When her son walked through the door, tired but smiling, the sight nearly broke her. For a moment, she considered staying silent. She imagined them sitting down to dinner, pretending that everything was normal. But the lie was already too heavy. It pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Sit down," she said gently. He looked at her, confused by her tone, but he obeyed. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many ordinary conversations had taken place. Margaret folded her hands together to stop them from shaking. She told him everything. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care, but she did not hold back the truth. She told him about the early morning walk, the bundle, the lake. She told him about what she found and about the confrontation that followed. With every sentence, his face changed. At first, he laughed softly, thinking it was a misunderstanding. Then the laughter faded. His eyes darkened as the details sank in. When she finished, the silence between them felt unbearable. He shook his head, over and over, as if trying to push the words away. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "You're wrong." Margaret reached across the table, her voice breaking. "I wish I were." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. Anger, confusion, and disbelief battled across his face. When he finally spoke again, his voice was raw. "Why didn't she tell me?" Margaret had no answer that could ease his pain. When his wife returned home later that night, the truth could no longer be avoided. The conversation that followed was filled with tears, raised voices, and shattered trust. Denials crumbled under the weight of what Margaret had uncovered. What had once been hidden was now exposed, impossible to deny. By morning, the authorities were involved. Margaret watched as the woman packed a small bag, her movements slow and defeated. There was no anger left in her now, only exhaustion and fear. When she was taken away, the house felt painfully empty. The days that followed were heavy and quiet. Friends and neighbors asked questions that Margaret and her son did not know how to answer. The truth, once revealed, spread quickly, changing how everything looked. Her son withdrew into himself. He spoke little, moved slowly, and carried a grief that had no clear shape. Margaret stayed close, offering what comfort she could, though she knew she could not fix what had been broken. Trust, once shattered, did not return easily. Weeks passed. Life continued in small, uneven steps. Some mornings were harder than others. The laughter that once filled the house was gone, replaced by a fragile silence. Margaret thought often about instinct. How she had doubted herself. How close she had come to ignoring the quiet voice that told her something was wrong. Listening to it had brought pain, but it had also brought truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret returned to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the sky just as it always had. Birds moved along the shore. The reeds swayed gently in the breeze. To anyone else, it was just a peaceful place. Margaret stood there for a long time, watching the surface of the water. It no longer felt like it was hiding anything. The secrets had been pulled into the light, no matter how painful that process had been. She felt older now, heavier with knowledge, but also clearer. Living a lie would have been easier in the moment, but it would have slowly destroyed them all. As she turned away from the lake, Margaret knew one thing for certain. The truth had changed her family forever. But it had also set them free.